Hey, what's up guys? It's Rick with the Digital Divide, and today I want to talk about the Sega Saturn. It's one of my favorite systems of all time, and specifically I want to recommend some great games that you should check out if you're just now getting into collecting the Saturn. Now, unfortunately, the Saturn is one of the most expensive consoles to collect, and that has to do with the fact that the games are super rare for it, because the console itself didn't sell too well in the United States, so there aren't too many US copies of these games. But I did my best to find a variety, some affordable, some not so much, but it's just a list of really great games and a lot of genres. Now, this is not going to be a list of like the best games on the Saturn, it's just a general list of games that I think you should check out. That said, let's get started. So the first game I want to spotlight here is Mega Man X4. This might be my favorite Mega Man game ever made on any platform. The animation quality is superb. This game featured full transparencies, which, if you know the hardware of the Sega Saturn, was not common for that platform. It was just so much fun. The colors were vibrant, the controls were spot on, the animations were great. It was just so much fun to play this game, and I can't even tell you how many hours I put into it. Highly recommended. The next game I want to spotlight here is Nights into Dreams. I'm sure you've heard of this game. It is one of the most unique games I've ever seen. It's a combination of like a quasi-open world 3D platformer, but then when you join with the Night character, who's like this ethereal creature that has the ability to fly throughout your dreams, it turns into like a side-scrolling 2.5D perspective game. It is incredibly smooth. This is the game that launched with the Sega Saturn 3D controller so that you could use analog controls in a 3D space, and it was so much fun, and I could not recommend it more. The next game I want to talk about is called In the Hunt. This game doesn't get anywhere near the amount of praise that it should. It is like an underwater side-scrolling shooter, and the animation quality in this game is absolutely astounding. The closest analog that I could give for this would be like basically this is a version of Metal Slug but underwater, and you can see that a lot of the visual inspiration kind of comes from that. I don't know if any of the developers from that game worked on this one, but it's a phenomenal game. It's so much fun, and I can't recommend it highly enough, but it is kind of hard to find because it's one of the more obscure Saturn titles. The next game I want to talk about is Daytona USA, specifically the Championship Circuit Edition. This game was a huge step up from the version of Daytona USA that launched with the Sega Saturn initially. This version of the game has a much more stable frame rate. It has a lot less pop-in. It has a farther draw distance. It has a better selection of tracks and cars, and it's one of the best racing games on the Saturn in my opinion. Visually, I know it doesn't look super impressive today, but back in the day, this was really impressive stuff. There were a lot of elements in the background, such as like these roller coasters here that you can see. The next game I want to talk about is VIRTUA Cop 2. This game was a huge step up, both visually and, like I would say, from a variety standpoint from the first Virtual Cop that came out. When I played this in the arcade, I thought to myself, they're not going to be able to port this to the Saturn because there's too much going on. You can see that there's this really cool car chase in the beginning. There's sections later on where you're like in a metro station and you're fighting guys between cars, and it's just a lot. And the game runs flawlessly. It looks really cool, and it's one of my favorite light gun shooters that has ever been released. The next game I want to talk about is Marvel Super Heroes vs. Street Fighter. This game needs very little introduction if you were a fan of Capcom fighters. This was huge in the arcades, and if you were lucky enough to have the Saturn version and a RAM expansion card, you got the best looking version of this game. The animations were superb, colors were amazing, sprite quality was great. This was just a classic. Next game I want to talk about is Virtual On Cyber Troopers. This is an arena-based 3D fighting game where you get to control your choice of a giant mechanized robot, and it looked visually stunning. And again, this is one of those games where when I played it in the arcade, I was like, how are they going to port this to the Saturn? But they did it, and it runs flawlessly, and it runs at a higher resolution than most games on the Saturn, surprisingly. The closest analog, I would say, if you're curious, is probably the Power Stone games on the Dreamcast. This is kind of like that. The next game I want to talk about is Saturn Bomberman. Look, you're either a fan of Bomberman or you're not, but if you are, then this is probably the best Bomberman game ever made, and the reviews support that. This game was highly regarded when it came out. It's one of the most fun games that you can play with friends. It supported the maximum number of players that the Saturn would support at the time, and it is so much fun. It's so vibrant. I know that visually it doesn't look amazing, but I mean, that's every Bomberman game. This one is very expensive, though, if you're looking to collect it. Speaking of expensive games, the next game on my list is Burning Rangers. This is one of the last games that came out on the Saturn. In this game, you play a futuristic firefighter of sorts, and it was completely 3D. You run around, you have this jetpack, and the jetpack provides a level of mobility that very few games on the Saturn had. You can do flips in the air and all kinds of cool stuff, but this game is incredibly expensive if you are looking to buy it on eBay. And I also recommend that if you're going to get it, you really do need to play it with a 3D Saturn controller. If you try to play this with a D-pad, you're not going to have a great time, and you're probably going to think this game sucks. If you play it with the 3D controller, though, it completely changes the experience, and all of a sudden, the gameplay just snaps, and it is that good. I definitely recommend checking this one out if you can. The next game I want to talk about is Three Dirty Dwarves. This is an amazing side-scrolling 2D beat-em-up game. Think Ninja Turtles, the arcade Ninja Turtles games. If you're into those, you would absolutely love this. This is probably the most fun I've had playing with a friend on the Saturn. You control one of these three dwarves. It is very much like, you know, the Ninja Turtle games that came out on the Super Nintendo and the Genesis back in the 16-bit era, but with higher fidelity, and there are levels that have fully 3D polygonal elements to them, but the variety of the characters here, the world design is just super creative and unlike anything else I had played at the time. The next game I want to talk about is CROC, The Legend of Gobos. A lot of people are probably going to give me crap for adding this to the list of must-play Saturn games, but I loved this game. Maybe it's because the Saturn didn't have a whole lot of like 3D character-driven platformers in the vein of Mario 64, but I really enjoyed my time with this one. I beat it. Unfortunately, I had to play the sequel on the PlayStation because the Saturn did not get this sequel. I think it was dead at that time, but it's such a great game. The next game I want to talk about is Astal. This is a beautifully rendered 2D, traditional old-school platformer. At first glance, you probably think, oh, there's nothing too special about this, but the level design, the color palette that they chose to use, and the scaling effects that they used definitely made it something that was well beyond the capabilities of like the Super Nintendo. And there was a lot of voice acting as well due to the CD media that the Saturn provided. This is just a great game overall, and I had so much fun with it. Highly recommended, although again, a little bit pricey if you're looking to pick it up. Shining Force 3 is the next game that I want to highlight here, and this game was unbelievably fun. This is a strategy game, and the overworld takes place on a 3D map, but with two-dimensional sprites that portray the characters, both the enemies and the heroes of the story. The interesting part, though, is that when you actually go into combat, it turns into full 3D, very much kind of like, I'd say, Final Fantasy VII. And this game was unbelievably fun. I unfortunately never got to beat it all the way through. I got about halfway through it, and then I lost my save game because the CMOS battery on my Saturn died, which I had the save stored internally like an idiot. I should have had it on a cart, but I definitely plan to get back to it again. One of the best games on the system by a mile, especially if you like strategy games or RPGs on the Saturn. The next game I want to talk about is Panzer Dragoon 2. This is my favorite entry in the series, yes, even more so than Panzer Dragoon Saga. This was Star Fox 64 before Star Fox 64. I know it doesn't look super impressive in this video, but at the time these graphics were mind-blowing. And the gameplay matched. It was so much fun. You could fly in the air, you could walk on the ground, you could look in any direction you wanted to look. It was on rails, but there was some flexibility in movement and pathing, and it was such a great game. Your dragon even evolves throughout each level. It changes color and shape depending on how you play the game, and this is just such a great game in my opinion. It holds up very, very well even today. The next game I want to talk about is Sonic Jam. This is basically a collection of old Sonic games. So every single Genesis Sonic game was included on this disc, and there was like a museum where you could look at old artwork and screenshots and all kinds of things. But there was also a fully 3D open world Sonic level included in this package, and if you compare it to something like Mario 64, which we're seeing now, I actually think the texture work and the geometric density of the environments is way more impressive in Sonic Jam. If you look over at Mario 64, there's barely any texture work. All the trees are made out of flat sprites, whereas the trees in the Sonic game have polygonal elements to them. And this was incredibly impressive at the time, and I wish they would have made a full game out of it. Unfortunately, this game launched towards the very end of the Saturn's lifespan, so they never had the chance to fully develop this engine that they used and the concept behind it. The next game I want to talk about is Darius Gaiden. This is an amazing side-scrolling shoot-'em-up. I had a lot of fun with it. Visually, it's not that impressive. It doesn't look like anything that is a massive leap above, the Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo. Although some of the boss designs do touch that and have some polygonal elements. And overall, though, the gameplay is what matters, and this game is a lot of fun. I had so much fun getting through it. I did beat this one to completion back in the day, and something I definitely want to revisit soon. The next game I want to talk about is Dragon Force. This probably top 5 Saturn games ever made, but it depends on whether or not you like the genre. This is a strategy game where the battleground is a flat, plane, and then it's filled with these really cool sprite designs. And towards the end of the game, you literally have hundreds and hundreds of troops on screen at once. I know you're not seeing that in this video because I couldn't get far enough into it, but it's a really, really fun game. It's just you choose your general, and then you command an army, and you take over land, and the story is deep. This is a really, really expensive game, though, if you want to pick it up on the Saturn, and it's really long, too. I mean, you could put, you could probably put 80 to 100 hours into this game if you really wanted to, but it's a lot of fun. The sprite work is nice, the scaling is cool, and again, once you get towards the later stages, you'll have hundreds and hundreds of troops on screen at any given time, and it is something really impressive to see. So the last game on my list is Grandia. This is the only game that was on my list that was never released in the United States for the Sega Saturn. It was only released in Japan. That said, there is a fan-made English translation patch that you can download, and you can burn your own copy of this game that has English subtitles. So this is one of the few Saturn games that I don't own the original copy because I don't collect Japanese imports, but I did find and burn my own copy of the game with English dubbing because one was never officially released. So that was the only way that I could play the game and actually understand what they were saying, because I don't speak Japanese. This game visually looks absolutely incredible. I think even today, the frame rate is not the best. You can tell that the Saturn's chugging along here, but you can't argue that the art design and the general production of this for the time that it released was really top-notch. Anyways, guys, that's going to do it for me today. There are so many more games that I wish I had time to cover today, and I'll probably do several other videos outlining the rest of the great Saturn games that you should check out. But as always, for now, thanks for watching.